The Forked Ways. Chapter 10. Emerald Eyes. After Silver left with his mother, Fletch couldn't stop thinking about him. Fear had taken hold of him. Had he jeopardized their friendship in one reckless moment? But then Silver could be so reckless himself. Fletch dreaded facing him at school the next day, but at the same time longed to be with him. He tried to act as if nothing were the matter, but his father seemed to want to talk. Mark Forrester puttered about in the kitchen, finally made a cup of tea, then came into the parlor and pretended to read. After a few minutes he put the book down. "Fletch, what would you think if I asked Liz Kendall out on a date?" Fletch looked up from his homework, surprised and a little relieved that his father hadn't been aware of his distress. "I think she'd probably say yes." "Well, that's not exactly what I meant." He sipped his tea. "You wouldn't be upset?" As his father's question hung in the air, Fletch felt the old anguish rising inside him, but decided to ignore it. "I think you ought to ask her out, Dad." Mark nodded. "Wonder if she's interested in anyone." "Silver told me she was seeing a guy over at the power company for a while, but I think that's over." His father picked up his book again, but Fletch could tell he was still preoccupied with Elizabeth Kendall. Fletch scarcely slept that night. The orchard was dark, apart from the torches which blazed like dark red stars. Men spoke low and earnestly. Leather creaked. A horse whinnied softly as the burden it carried was cut free, dropped to the ground, and dragged to the well. There was no splash, only a heavy muffled thud, oddly hollow and distant as it echoed up the stone-lined shaft. A bag was cut open, emptied, the quicklime soundless as it fell. Then stones, heavy stones, fell one by one until the groans from the bottom of the well had ceased. Fletch awakened feeling sick from the dream, and then he thought of Silver. His father seemed to be in a good mood during breakfast, and Fletch envied the ease with which he took command of his emotions. A jumble of thoughts raced through his brain as he crossed the porch and walked over to the truck, but when Silver leaned over and opened the door, all his carefully planned speeches seemed useless. "Morning," he said, getting in. "Morning," Silver said. He held out a handful of ragged wildflowers. Fletch could hardly speak for surprise. "What are these for?" he managed. "For you, of course. Roadside flowers were the best I could do on short notice." Fletch took them, trying to keep his hand steady. Then he made himself look at Silver. "You really aren't upset at all, are you?" "Well, I'll admit I had some adjusting to do." Silver looked at him sidelong, offering the barest hint of a smile. "One thing's sure, you always surprise me." At school, Fletch put the flowers in his locker. All day long the thought of them brightened his spirit, giving him a feeling of warmth and security. Even so, he was a little relieved when his father asked to come along on their visit to Betsy Weathers that afternoon. Fletch wanted to stretch his wings with Silver, but his father's presence allowed him to breathe freely for the time being, and to keep his unsteady emotions in check. Betsy lived beyond the far edge of town, at the end of a street which led to a field by the lake. Willows grew close together there, linking gnarled arms and spreading green hair above the water. They found her out back when they arrived. She carried a plastic bucket, from which she drew a small cup filled with pellets of fish food. They walked with her as she made her way along the bank, scattering it over the water. "Just look at that," she said, pointing to the bright flashes of sunlight on the water. "When I was little, my sister used to tell me those were ferry boats." She handed the bucket to Fletch. "I see you've made friends with this young scoundrel," she said, nodding to Silver. "I reckon we get along," Fletch replied. "Fletch and Silver have been wondering if you could tell us anything about the cornerstones of the old church," Mark said. Fletch found some signs engraved on the bottom of the stones. Silver handed her the sketches Fletch had made of the designs, and Fletch explained to her how he had come upon them. "We figure they represent places, the 4 sites Bill and Dr. Kendall were looking for," he said. "The spiral could be the labyrinth in the woods near the old harbor plantation, and Silver thinks the circles could represent the church." Betsy looked at the drawings intently. "They do represent places," she told them. "Not places around here, but communities." She pointed to the 3 joined circles. "This one is Assembly, but it was also once the sign of the Green Island community in France, which was destroyed. The tree is a symbol for Oak Hollow up in North Carolina, and the 5 fingers are from Italy, where there is a very old community at Pentadactylo. And this labyrinth is the one at Saul's Ward in the English Fens, though we do have one like it in the forest here." "How strange," Mark said. "They're places where our ancestors settled, the people who called themselves the Friends of God." "But why would they have been carved into the stones of the old church?" Silver asked. "And when, I wonder?" "The when may be easier to answer than the why," Betsy answered. "The old church was built during a year of trouble. It was 1833, I think. The United States was taking possession of the Indian lands, and there were a lot of Indian families here in town, had been for 40 years. The first pastored assembly had been a Creek. A lot of the people in the other towns resented that sort of thing, over in Jug Tavern especially. One night some men came across the river and burned the brush arbor where they'd been holding services. When the church was rebuilt, those stones were set at the corners." "Do you remember anything about the signs being put on the stones?" Silver asked. Betsy shook her head. "I suppose I ought to, but this is the first I've heard of them." She frowned, looking off across the fields toward the church. "It could be nobody knew about these signs, except for whoever carved them. Just a few months after the church was built, the soldiers came. They rounded up the Indian families in Assembly and deported them to camps in Oklahoma. It was part of what came to be called the Trail of Tears. A good many things were lost or forgotten during those days." Betsy hesitated. "I suppose the signs may have been intended to reassure the people here that they were not alone in the world, that there were other communities which had found ways to survive." Silver looked again at the drawings Fletch had made. "Well, that probably makes more sense than what I had in mind. I thought they might be places in the forest. You know, holy places that had something to do with the Indians or settlers. I thought if we found them, we could use them to work against the Wog, the way Bill and Pop tried to do." Betsy looked at him curiously. "Maybe the signs on the stones are the 4 holy places, and the places are the communities of the Friends of God." Silver still seemed unconvinced. "Betsy, have you still got those maps of the Moon Lake district that Bill and Pop used to label all the Indian signs?" "I do. Would you like to look at them?" Silver nodded. "If you don't mind, I want to check something." The maps were actually a series of large aerial photographs, which they spread out patchwork on the rug in Betsy's den, joining the edges so that they formed a fairly continuous picture. Quickly they found the church and the pastorium and the old harbor plantation house. "The labyrinth is here, beyond Moon Lake," said Silver, pointing to one of several black triangles which had been drawn on the photographs by hand. "The old church would have been about here. You can see the cemetery and the driveway plain enough." He studied the map for a moment. "I'm guessing that the circles on the stones might represent the site of the old church, where the stones themselves are located. And look, the line between it and the labyrinth runs exactly west to east." "But what about the others?" Fletch asked. "Well, let's see." He studied the aerials carefully. "The Sabbath oak, that big tree at the old campground, is here," he pointed. "Let's start there and go north for the same distance as the other line." Everyone watched carefully as Silver drew his finger along the photograph. "Look, it crosses the other one at the center, and it ends up here." His fingertip rested on an area deep within the old plantation. "What's there?" Fletch asked. "Do you have any idea?" Silver looked up. "It looks like the place where there's a big outcropping of rocks. I've been out there lots of times, even camped there." "How many rocks?" Betsy asked him softly. 4 or 5, Silver told her. 5, I think. "Pentadactylo," Betsy said with a nod, "like the 5-fingered mountain in Calabria." "Silver, I admit you and Fletch have astonished me." "So the signs have a double meaning, then," Fletch ventured. "They're symbols for those other communities, but they're also actual places around here." "So it appears," Betsy acknowledged. "Could we get to those rocks in the truck?" Fletch asked. "There's still a while before dark. We could go take a look around." Silver looked at the map and nodded. "One of the old roads leads out there, if it's still passable." Betsy glanced toward the window. "Might be better to wait for daylight. You all don't want to get stuck out there in the dark." "It shouldn't take long," Silver assured her. "Maybe tomorrow we could go to the campground and look at the Sabbath oak." Betsy gave each of them a hug. "Be careful, then. And Mark, you go with them. Something's in the air this evening. I can't tell what just yet, but my teeth are getting nervous." They climbed into Silver's truck. He turned around, pulled into Willow Street, and headed back into town. Mark glanced through Silver's collection of 8-track tapes. "Buckwheat Zydeco, Tangerine Dream. Who comes up with the names for these bands?" "They're cool, Dad," Fletch insisted. "Pop one in." At the highway, they turned right toward the church and continued for another mile, until they came to what was once the main entrance of the harbor plantation. A rusty chain stretched between 2 crumbling brick gateposts, but it wasn't locked. Nothing was visible from the road, only the overgrown drive littered with fallen branches, but at the crest of the hill the burnt-out shell of the vast house appeared, looking secretive and haunted. "Those stone walls are all that are left," Mark told them. "Most antebellum houses round here were built of wood, but the harbors used granite quarried over at Academy Church. The barns didn't burn, and if nothing's happened since I last saw them, they're still in amazing shape." Several roads led to different parts of the property, and the one Silver chose took them through overgrown fields and woodland. Silver drove slowly, avoiding areas of erosion and jutting rock. Fletch found it strange to look out of the lowered window and realize that, apart from neglect, the view was much the same as it had been more than a century before, when the land had been worked by slaves, his own ancestors probably among them. The road passed the base of a wooded hill, and here Silver stopped. Among the trees at the top, Fletch glimpsed several granite boulders, some of them as large as small houses. They left the truck and climbed to the rocks. 2 were larger than the others, each with an overhanging ledge blackened by smoke. In the tallest rock, a vertical rift split the granite into 2 sections. Silver showed Fletch and his father along a path through the cleft and around the back of the rock. The floor of the gap was filled with heaps of leaves. It was very narrow, no more than 2 feet from wall to wall. The path climbed a series of narrow ledges among the boulders, winding its way to the top of the tallest rock. At a steep section of the trail along the final part of the ascent, Silver reached back to help Fletch up the slope. The sudden contact brought the moment into sharp focus. He was aware of a bird singing nearby, of the sound of acorns crunching beneath his sneakers, of the breeze in Silver's pale hair and the sureness of his grasp. Silver kept his hand for a few moments after he joined him at the top, and this set all his nerves dancing. The rock provided an impressive view of the surrounding country, and the 3 of them stood watching as the lowering sun colored the trees on the far hills. The air had grown cool and sweet. Fletch moved over to the edge of the gap and squatted down, careful not to slip on the acorns or matted leaves. He felt compelled to look over the edge at least once while they were here. The rift was deeper than it had seemed from the bottom, and the slope was very sharp. Just as he was about to inch back to safety, he saw something move in the shadows at the bottom of the gap. At first he could make out nothing but the shapes of tumbled rocks and drifts of leaves. Then he saw two slanting emerald eyes shining out of the darkness beneath him. He gripped the unyielding surface of the granite and felt his thumbnail bend backwards and split. The sharp, breathless pain gave him an instant of freedom, and he used it to shout Silver's name. Instantly, he and Mark were beside him. Fletch lurched to his feet, trembling. "What is it?" Silver asked. "The wolf," Fletch managed. "It's down there." But that was no longer true. A wild animal scent rushed up from the gap. The world darkened as it swept over him. Fletch felt claws snare his arms, savage jaws clamped down upon his shoulders, and he struggled frantically to break free. In a frenzy of panic, he lashed out with his fists, striking solidly against flesh and bone. Then he was thrown flat against the hard stone, his head reeling, his ears ringing with his father's shouts of alarm. Fletch raised up, still terrified. His father whirled to face him. "Silver's over the edge," he cried. "He's gone over the edge of the rock." What do you see? Betsy watched as Mark and Fletch left with Silver in the truck. Beyond the tops of the trees, the clouds moved, very white clouds in a kite blue sky. A wasp hovered beyond the porch, moving tentatively in one direction, then changed course and flew out of sight above the eaves. The clouds rose higher above the trees. They looked bright like noonday, though evening was still settling on the forest below. The wasp moved in a different manner from the clouds. It had enough sense to decide things, to make a change of direction at a moment's notice. The clouds moved at the urging of currents of air, without thought or conscious purpose. Even as she watched, the light changed, and the trees, the fields, were suddenly brighter. Evening had not yet fully taken hold, and for a few minutes there was a gift of late afternoon sun. The light lessened as she watched, then reappeared with less strength. A September day in Georgia did not fade fast. Betsy believed she had enough time for a walk before dark. "Look there. What do you see?" Betsy stopped to observe. She saw the crepe myrtle by the edge of the water, and beyond that the far bank of the pond, and beyond that the poplar, sweet gum, and dogwoods, and beyond that a glimpse of the street and the houses on either side. A car passed, only a brief flash, scarcely enough for her to make out the color, certainly not enough for her to see the people within, but she knew they were thinking of going to the picture show over in Athens. "Is there any such thing as certainty?" asked four pines standing in a row. "No," declared an azalea, strangled in vines. "Not likely," said the crow of a rooster, the caw of a crow. "Perhaps," said the whisper of a car on the street. "What does it matter?" asked the sun through the leaves. From a house deep in the forest, nearly 3 miles away from her own, Betsy heard the click of a door as it closed, the calling of a name. She felt a flutter of concern. Through most of her life she had filtered impressions from the creatures around her, and even now, as old as she was, some things surprised her. "It's Liz Kendall," she realized suddenly. "The vision is mine, but these feelings are hers." She looked up. The curve of the moon came into view, seemingly more thin and wispy than the clouds themselves. She raised her hands and looked toward the forest, wondering about Silver. In that moment, horror took hold of her, and she realized too late what a terrible mistake she had made in letting Silver and the foresters go. Grim-faced, she returned to the house. alive on the inside. Josh Avery couldn't find the trap. He was sure he had put it on his workbench in the shop, but it wasn't there now. He doubted that anyone in the family would have taken it first without letting him know. The bone in his arm was healing, and the pain was less severe than he had expected. The trap had not been rusty, and though Doc had given him a tetanus shot as a matter of course, there did not appear to be any danger of blood poisoning. Josh knew the trap was old. It wasn't the sort of thing you could buy at the farmer's supply over in Jefferson. Too big for muskrat or beaver. More like something an old backwoodsman would have used to trap a wolf or a panther. But who could have taken it, and why? Though the shop hadn't been locked, nothing within appeared to have been disturbed. The tools on the workbench and hanging from the walls were all as he had left them. Still, something was different, he was sure. Something didn't smell right. Josh bent and looked under the workbench. There, between an air compressor and a battery charger, was a wide-mouthed glass jug. The black cap had been removed and placed beside it. The only thing sealing the jug was a scrap of burlap, tied in place with a piece of baling twine. The liquid within the jug seemed all shadows and light, yellow, brown, and black, and something solid as well. Josh clicked on a work light. The thing in the jug had been an animal, a possum maybe, or a large wharf rat, but it had seen better days. Now it was mostly decomposed, a misshapen, gelatinous thing with teeth, claws, and a long tail. Josh breathed a curse and drew back in revulsion. Then recognition came to him. A gaff. It's some kind of a gaff, like a pickled punk. As a young man in the carnival business, he had been familiar with such things from the sideshows. Shrunken heads, four-eyed cats, fetal pigs in formaldehyde or alcohol passed off as unborn children. Gaffs were fakes, but well-crafted ones could look horrifyingly real. Cotton wheels. It had to have been. Josh managed an uneasy chuckle. Cotton was the only man in assembly who shared Josh's carnival background, and gaffs had been his specialty. Though Josh hadn't touched the jug, in the glare of the work light he saw the animal turn lazily in the translucent fluid, as if it had been prodded into motion. Dead, he thought, but alive on the inside. He pondered how to get rid of it. He couldn't just dump it somewhere around the house or the shop. The odor coming from the jug made him nauseous just to be near it. Best thing to do was to haul it off somewhere deep in the woods and bury it, but that would have to wait until tomorrow. Cotton was a fool, and a mean one. What if one of the grandchildren had found this thing? Josh had known Cotton's father, but hadn't liked him. Crowther Wills had been a bootlegger during Prohibition, and involved in the Ku Klux Klan. The Wills family was a strange bunch on the whole. They kept to the bottomlands near the swamp, along with 2 or 3 other families to whom they were related, and other people didn't venture down the narrow dirt road without good reason. When Cotton had gotten into trouble as a young man, it was Josh who had gotten him a place in the traveling carnival where he had worked the sideshows. Josh soon discovered that Cotton had the flair it took to be the outside talker, the pitch man who lured the crowd into the sideshow tent. But his greatest talent was in fabricating gaffs. They had become increasingly grotesque and bizarre. From wire, papier-mâché, and animal skins, Cotton had crafted creatures worthy of nightmares. Troubled and uneasy, Josh turned out the light, closed the door to the shop, and locked it. Only later, much later, did he realize he should have capped the jug.